Welcome to the How to Be Awesome at Your Job podcast, the show where brilliant professionals share how to sharpen the universal skills required to flourish at work. Enjoy more career fun, wins, meaning, and money with your host, Pete Makaitis.
Hello and welcome to episode 915 with Tim Elmore. We brought Tim back because he was so much fun last time. And this time, Tim is sharing some wisdom when it comes to generational diversity at work. You got boomers, millennials, Gen Z. Folks tend to have some of their own preferences and ways of working, which can be delightful or frustrating. And so Tim is going to dig into it. So you'll learn, one, how generalizations across the generations can be both helpful and harmful. Two, the do's and don'ts of interacting with each generation. And three, the keys to turning generational conflict into team harmony. So if you want to check out the show notes or the transcript or the links to items that we've referenced, please visit us at awesomeatyourjob.com/EP915. Now, here's a bit about Tim. Dr. Tim Elmore is founder and CEO of Growing Leaders, found at growingleaders.com, an Atlanta-based nonprofit organization created to develop emerging leaders. His work grew out of 20 years serving alongside Dr. John C. Maxwell. Elmore has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, USA Today, and many other cool places to talk about leading multiple generations in the marketplace. He's written over 35 books, including Habitudes, Images That Form Leadership Habits and Attitudes, and his latest, A New Kind of Diversity, Making the Different Generations on Your Team a Competitive Advantage. Now, here's Tim. Tim, welcome back to How to Be Awesome at Your Job.
Thank you, Pete. Great to be with you.
Well, I'm excited to dig into the wisdom of your book, A New Kind of Diversity, Making the Different Generations on Your Team a Competitive Advantage. But first, you have survived a plane crash, and somehow we never talked about that last time. What's the deal here?
Yeah. Well, I don't just go around starting conversations with, hey, did you know I survived a plane?
Yeah. Well, we should have. Well, we're going to start this one that way, Tim.
Well, maybe. Yeah. Well, the crazy thing was that was years and years ago, but I was in New Zealand. It was a private plane. I was being flown with a buddy of mine by a pilot that was not instrument rated. And he was trying to land on a field. I was going to speak at a big youth camp back then, 30 years ago. And he wasn't able to land the plane. He started to come down. The trees or the forest are right here. He realizes he can't touch down in time before the trees began. So he takes the plane, shoots it straight up in the air and says, tighten your seatbelts. I got to try this landing again. But as he's shooting up into the air, we get about 120 feet in the air and the engine stalls and we drop to the ground. So about 12 stories we drop. And Grant, the pilot, went right through the windshield. It was awful.
Oh, my goodness.
And the other three of us were beat up and thrown around. Our seatbelts broke too, but we all survived. So it was quite the deal. Yeah. But as you can imagine, I was in New Zealand. I had to get on a plane to fly back home. So I had to jump back on the proverbial horse and ride again.
Wow. So I don't have a great deal of knowledge of aviation, but how common is it to survive a fall of that distance? This sounds more or less miraculous, Tim.
Yeah, it was. This sounds so cliche, but I really do believe in miracles. I don't spiritualize everything, but I think, my gosh, I'm still around for a reason. I've got to make the most of my time. I think my sense of urgency that I currently experience probably came from knowing at any moment I could be gone, and I want to make the very most of it. So I'm loving my family better. I'm about the business of what I do much better and less lackadaisical perhaps than before that time. But I think that's the good that can come from the not so good along the way.
Wow. Okay, well, I'm grateful that you are alive and here, and we are speaking again. At last conversation, I think was really rich with some juicy stories I've thought about numerous times since. This book, A New Kind of Diversity, Making the Different Generations on Your Team a Competitive Advantage. I'll tell you, I'll be candid with you, Tim. I usually shy away from the different generations, generalizations content, but I was like, Tim is so darn good. If I could trust somebody to handle this decently, it's going to be Tim. So let's get some of the tough stuff out of the way.
Okay.
Tim, isn't this just wild overgeneralization? And how is this even helpful?
Yeah, I do get that question. So please know you're not alone at all. And yet, I think there's another part of our brain that would say, but we do realize we're a little different. 20-somethings are different than 60-somethings, but ageism and chronocentrism almost always come up at this point.
Chronocentrism. I don't think I've ever heard that word before.
Okay, so let me give you both real quick working definitions. Ageism is, isn't it true, 60-somethings tend to think alike, 20-somethings, regardless of the time in history where we are. You're more conservative when you're older, you're more progressive when you're younger, blah, blah, blah. And that is true. There is an element of truth in that. And chronocentrism is the tendency we have at whatever life station we're in to think we're right and they're wrong. The older, the younger, kids are just fragile snowflakes today, or those old folks are just dinosaurs, that sort of thing.
Like ethnocentrism, but chrono time.
Exactly. Chronology.
Okay, gotcha.
That's right. You got it. You picked it up. You get an A on that test, Pete. I want you to know.
Oh, thank you. Is it Greek or Latin? I was a Latin student back in the day. It really expands your vocabulary.
It does. I'm sure it does. Yeah. So anyway, all that to say, my goal in this book is not to stereotype, but to understand. So I'm trying to help readers. It's not scientific. In fact, this is a social science, not a science. It's soft science, but it is, I think, a very helpful thing to have a bit of an encyclopedia. If you're 58, let's say, and you're managing a company and you've got these Gen Zers coming in, you go, oh my God, I don't understand these kids today, to say, well, let me help you step into their brain just a little bit. Here's the narrative that they've grown up with. Here's the wet cement that they were shaped in. And then to know a little bit, you're a little bit more informed as you do that interview or do that onboarding or do the performance review.
Well, could you start by sharing with us maybe some differing survey results or research or studies that say convincingly, yep, people in different generations do in fact tend to, on aggregate, on the whole, more often than not, operate differently in these kinds of ways?
Yeah. Well, let me just share some really recent data that might be a fun fodder for discussion. When I talk to managers, for instance, at a workplace, and they're asking, well, what should I expect from an interview with a 22-year-old recently out of college? One of the things that Generation Z brings is a very paradoxical high sense of agency and high sense of anxiety at the same time. So the agency, they feel, what that means? It's just like, I got this, I can do this. I think was fostered by the smartphone. I've been looking at things since I was 4 years old on a tablet. I think I know all that I need to know to do this. And so a Gen Zer comes in with a high sense of agency. At the same time, however, we all know, I think, that mental health issues are a thing right now for high school students, college students, young professionals, panic attacks, anxiety, depression. But here's the irony. I think anxiety was brought on by the same smartphone. So the high sense of I'm in control and the high sense of I'm out of control come from this smart device that I think ambushed us, and we did not know what it would do, particularly to the younger generations.
Yes.
So I know that it's not fully answering your question, but that's something I think we either in midlife need to know. It's going to be a thing.
Well, yeah, certainly there's no doubt that our upbringings are different. I just turned 40 recently.
Yeah, okay. Congratulations and happy birthday.
Well, thank you. I remember our home was kind of cutting edge when we had dial-up internet in my youth.
Yeah.
But I certainly had several years on this planet in which I was able to read, and we didn't have the internet. So that was a thing that was going on, and I could see certainly how that can shape things. But I guess, yes, what I'm really driving at is in terms of maybe incidences of anxiety, depression, or the proportion of people who strongly agree with this kind of statement is wildly different between folks who are 62 versus 22. Can you lay some of those sharp distinctions down for us?
Okay, sure. Yeah. Let me tell two quick stories that I think will vividly illustrate what you're asking about. In the book, I talk about Tony, true story. Tony, 2 years ago, was a senior in college at Ohio University, took a part-time job during his senior year at a paint store and loved his job part-time. During that senior year, he also happened to get on TikTok, okay? Of course he did. So he's on TikTok and he's now posting videos of himself mixing paints together. He's very clever. He's very creative. His account goes viral. Pete, by the time he gets 1.8 million followers, and 37 million views. He realizes, I should share this with the executives here. We could monetize this, So he puts a little slide deck together to make a presentation to the executive team, and he doesn't get one person interested in hearing from him. He doesn't get one set of eyeballs to look at a slide deck. Tony did get something, however, that he didn't expect. He got fired.
Okay.
Yep. So these older executives were just sure this young kid didn't know a thing, was probably stealing the paint, probably distracting to the customers, probably doing this on company time. And so they let him go. Well, Tony graduates, moves from Ohio to Florida, now has over 2 million followers, and has started his own paint store.
There you go.
Now, I'm sure there's parts to the story we don't understand, but here's one thing I do understand. It was a picture of the wide gap between the older generations that were in charge, that've been doing this thing for 30, 40 years, and we're pretty sure they know what they're doing. But here's a young buck coming up saying, there's a new platform that I'm on. Maybe you don't have intuition on how we could use this. I think I do. So I think just to answer your question specifically, I don't think very often people over 40 years old realize that the age of authority is dropping in the workplace. The age of authority is dropping. Think about a century ago. The age of authority was very high. In fact, grandma and grandpa, you listen to them because they've been around 70 years. Whatever they say, man, they collected a lot of wisdom. Well, today, rapid change happens. In fact, change happens so rapidly that young people are getting things faster than old people. And so they may first of all, they may be starting a company when they're 21 years old. But I think we don't realize that we need both timeless wisdom or timeless insight and timely intuition. So I talk about this in the book. Timeless insight, people that have been around the block a few times can share the stuff they know how to succeed at this company. But the timely intuition very often comes from the young. They can see where culture's going. And like Tony, they may figure out very creative ways to do things differently and capture another 1.5 million people that the older folks would not have found. So I'll just stop there, but that would just be one picture of what I'm talking about.
That is an intriguing picture. And so that age of authority, that's intriguing. Is it in fact true that the average age of person promoted to CEO of a Fortune 500 company is lower now than it was 10, 20, 40 years ago?
Yes, it is.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. So it's dropping slowly, not rapidly, because we still celebrate that sage. And by the way, I think you should know, 72% of high school students, public high school students in America, want to be an entrepreneur. 7 out of 10. Now, are they all going to succeed? Probably not. But the fact that 7 out of 10 want to start something more than join something, that tells me something. It tells me when they look at the current set of jobs or corporations to join, they go, I want to start my own. I don't know if I want to join that antiquated, stuffy 9-to-5 check-in, clock-in deal there. Now, they may need to learn, but I just believe I've got to do more listening as I age, not just telling. So I argue in the book, we need fluid intelligence. That's our first 40 years. We need crystallized intelligence. That's our second 40 years. And right now we're colliding more than collaborating in many workplaces. Age discrimination lawsuits are up at Fortune 500 companies like IBM, Marriott, WeWork. It's ridiculous.
Is it the older generation suing or the younger generation suing?
It's both. Think about it. The older suing the company because they feel like you didn't promote because you think I'm too old. But the younger saying the same thing. You didn't promote because you think I'm not, wise enough or old enough. You think I'm too young. So I feel for CEOs that are having to call upon their legal counsel to just solve a feud at the workplace, when if we were really learning to value the strengths that each generation brought to the table, we could really, really gain from this. And the book was designed really to be an encyclopedia where you don't have to read the whole thing, but you might want to read chapters 7 and 8 because you need help with Gen Zers and the millennials or whatever, that sort of thing. That's really what I wanted. Too often we were not. Well, here's what I really, really argue for, Pete, all the time. We've got to turn our frustration into fascination with each other. And I believe there's something I can be fascinated with all 4 generations at my nonprofit and the 5 generations that many people listening right now might have at their organization. but we're having a difficult time because we speak different languages. We have different values oftentimes. When you think about the marches that took place in 2020, the protests, Black Lives Matter and so forth, I'm sure there's exceptions to this rule, but it was mostly the millennials and the Gen Zers who were marching, mostly. And most of the Gen Xers and boomers are going, what are you doing? What, you stop wrecking that retail outlet there, whatever. And I just feel like it was a picture of young and old not understanding each other's mindsets.
All right. So Tim, let's give us the overview. So we are almost in 2024 now. Let's name the generations. Roughly how old are they today?
Yeah. Okay. Good question.
And we'll just to orient us for starters.
Yeah. First of all, let me say to every listener, this is an art, not a science, as I mentioned before. This is not psychology. Everybody has a unique personality. This is sociology. We're talking about the narratives of generations. So the oldest generation, Pete, that might still be at the workplace are past retirement age, typical retirement age, but people are living longer, working longer. So the builder generation would have been born 1929 to 1945. Many of our people in Washington, D.C. running our country right now are builder generation folks, okay? I mean, President Biden, 80, 81 years old right now. And by the way, I'll just share, this is not a partisan statement, but they should be paving the way for the next gen coming up rather than holding onto their office. But that's the builder generation. They were called builders because they built so much out of so little. Think about the years they were born, 1929 to 1945. Great Depression, World War II. The baby boomers come along next, 1946 to 1964. And they were called boomers because, well, frankly, 9 months after World War II was over, the maternity wards filled up, okay? So 76.4 million people were born in 18 years. That never happened before at all in America. They were called boomers, or we were called, I'm a boomer. We were called baby boomers. There was a boom of babies for 18 years, okay? After the baby boomers come the baby busters, or Generation X, 1965 to 1982, okay? So you might be the tail end of that generation. Are you kind of a XLennial, where you're kind of a Gen X millennial?
That's a hard word to say.
Yes, it is, especially for me.
I'm not going to even try, Tim. You're bold. Yes, I was born in 1983, and it's funny. I don't resonate a lot with either generational description.
Yeah, yes.
Maybe because I'm right on the border there.
Yeah. Well, social scientists would call you a tweener.
Okay.
If you're 5 years at the tail end of one generation or 5 years at the beginning of another, you're probably going to adopt characteristics of both and neither, And that's me with boomers and Xers. I'm right on that.
And not a tweaker, but a tweener.
That's right. Not a tweaker, a tweener. That's right.
Okay. Set the record straight.
Let it be known. Let it be known. That's right. All right. So Gen X was first called baby busters because their generation started with a public introduction of the birth control pill. So instead of a boom, it was a bust. If you add the contraceptive, you add on top of that Roe v. Wade in 1970, you have a shrinking population, not a booming population. So it's two hills and two valleys. It's a boom of babies, and then it drops to a valley with the Xers, another boom with the millennials, who are the next generation coming. So 83 to 2000, basically the 80s and 90s kids. And the millennials are the largest generation in American history, 80 million strong. They're the number one population in the workforce right now.
Sorry, Sam, if they're the largest, didn't you say never before or since have you seen such a fertility rate? But that's because we started from a smaller base back in the day with the boom.
Yes.
Okay, I'm with you. So it's a larger gross number, but a smaller rate.
Correct. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. So boomers were 76 million, millennials are 80 million. But then Gen Z follows Gen Y, or the millennials, and they are really the kids that have been born at the turn of the century. And they have had a very, very different experience. Think about their generation, even though they were just babies. First of all, this century started with the dot-com era bubble bursting. Y2K, we thought the world was going to explode, and then it didn't. September 11th, 2001, where all parents everywhere got scared to death for their children. Then you had, oh my gosh, the smartphone being released and growing into a normalized thing. So Gen Z would follow the millennials, millennials follow Gen X follows baby boomers, and baby boomers follow the builders. So
Okay.
there you have it.
And so you make a point. So we want to turn frustration into fascination. And my buddy Steve has strong opinions about boomers. And he's a listener. He cracks me up. He said, "Oh, hey, so one of your guests said he put himself through grad school with juggling."
Yeah.
I thought, this guy's a boomer.
Yeah.
And he's saying, boomers, man, they live their life on tutorial mode. It's not even easy mode in the video game. It's tutorial mode. They tell you which buttons to push. You can get through grad school and pay for it by juggling. Like, good luck. You're going to have at least a decade of student loan debt if you try to pull off an after school job, to fund your stuff. So we have some strong views on the boomer population. And so talk to us then about that core, that the frustration versus fascination, the conflict instead of collaboration. So lay it on us, Tim.
Okay. Well, first of all, the stereotyping, and by the way, Steve's probably a great guy. I would call that a stereotype. He may know a case or two or three, but I think we lump all older people as they're all talking about how they walk to school uphill both ways in the snow, that sort of thing. So boomers are stereotyped as dinosaur that has a very, very reconstructed memory of the past, that's, getting bigger and bigger every year. But I'll tell you what, a baby boomer has a stereotype about millennials and Gen Z. All the millennials are narcissistic and all those Gen Zers are fragile snowflakes. So we've all heard these terms. But here's what I know about the human brain. I talk about this in the book. Two things. Number one, people develop a little bit like wet cement, okay? So when cement is laid, let's say a new sidewalk is laid in the neighborhood, okay? On day one, you can press your handprint into that sidewalk very easily because it's wet. In the same way, during the first 20 plus years of our life, the neural pathways in our brain are very plastic. The plasticity is very, very soft, and you can learn quick and adapt quick, and it's just like wet cement. As we grow older, I don't want to say it hardens, but a little bit like wet cement. It's going to take a jackhammer by the time you're 40 to change that brain, to change your mind over something. So in the book, I put a 2-page spread that's a generation chart where I talk about interviews and both qualitative and quantitative data I gathered on each generation. And I gave a life paradigm, a mantra for each one, their view of authority, their view of education, their view of the future. Their sense of identity is very different. The sense of identity for a builder generation is, I am humble. My mom and dad grew up in the Great Depression. You were just all humble back then. It was wrong to be anything but humble. For Gen Z, their identity is very fluid, right? They may change their gender identity and it's fluid. So I just think it's helpful for a colleague or a boss to know, I just need to know this information to know not to gasp when I'm talking to someone from a different generation. And here's the other thing I know about our brains. When we see differences, we tend to distrust, we tend to avoid. Like, think about it, Pete. Let's just take you and me. If you and I didn't enjoy each other and you saw me talking with a bunch of boomers with gray hair and no hair, and we're all just good old boys talking at the water cooler, you might go, not my people. I don't think I want to join that because we know it's going to take work to really identify with that group of people. And we don't want to do that work. So we find our own people who talk like us, act like us, vote like us. That's just a natural thing. We don't want to work. We will find our own people where it's less work. And I'm arguing in this book, you get better if you're willing to do the work to connect with somebody from a different generation. So let me stop there, let you volley back.
I think that's a strong thesis. And I think that's true of so many domains. I guess diversity in every variety, first of all. And then just our general tendency to want to not do work and to be comfortable, but also the downside of too much time and comfort results in atrophy and not growing and strengthening and sharpening things. So with it being said that this is sociology and that these are broad generalizations and exceptions are abounding, why don't you go ahead and share with us some of those tidbits from this table to give us a feel for these pieces?
So I had so much fun going to retirement villages and talking to the builder generation folks, and then collecting some quantitative data and sorting it. But the mantra for The builder generation, remember 1929 to 1945, their mantra when they entered the workforce was, be grateful you have a job. And that's understandable, isn't it? I mean, my dad is a perfect example. My dad was born in 1930. So the first decade of his life, 1930, first decade of his life was the Great Depression. The next 5 years, World War II. That's what shaped him. So he just passed away in 2020 at 90 years old. He's frugal. He's conservative. He's grateful. And we save the wrapping paper at Christmas. We save every rubber band and plastic bag known to man. We have it up in the attic. You might need it next year. That was what they were conditioned to do. And I love the spirit of that generation. Okay. I am humble. I am grateful. The baby boomers come along, and I gave the boomers the life paradigm as they entered the workplace. I want better, because boomers grew up in a time of not of depression, but of expansion. You know, it was shopping malls were popping up everywhere. McDonald's was franchising. You know, we had just won or helped to win a world war. So America was feeling really great about ourselves between 1946 and 1964. The Xers come along. I gave the Xers the life paradigm. Keep it real. Keep it real. So that was a phrase that actually became a thing back then, you know, mid 60s all the way through the 70s. But think about, just for a minute, let me teach some history here. Think about the years that group of children were being formed and shaped before they moved into adulthood. By the late 1960s, not only was the Vietnam War going on, it was on TV. We could watch it at the 6 o'clock news with Walter Cronkite. And even though LBJ in the White House kept saying everything's fine over there in Vietnam, we started seeing footage that said, it's not fine over there. And then you had the Watergate scandal. Now you had a Democrat and a Republican both lying from the White House. There was a very real wall that went up in the minds and hearts of American adults that said, I'm not going to blindly trust a leader. And even though Gen X was just children back then, they saw a bunch of adults leading them, teaching them, coaching and parenting them. They grew up a little more cynical themselves. Keep it real. Don't tell me life is wonderful. Keep it real. Millennials come along. Okay, this is your generation now, even though you don't claim them, Pete. Millennials come along, and I gave the millennials a life paradigm. Life is a cafeteria. Now, let me explain why. This is not throwing them under the bus. My two kids are both millennials in their 30s, okay? Just like you go to a cafeteria, you grab your tray and your plate and you make up your meal, a little bit of broccoli, a little bit of roast beef, a little bit of Jell-O, and you tailor it for your taste buds. These young professionals are making almost every major decision of their life as if it were a buffet. Here are some examples. Years ago, my two kids stopped buying compact discs to get their music. Why would they buy a CD? There might be 5 songs I don't even like on that CD. I get one song at a time, form my own playlist on Spotify, Apple Music. It's a buffet. I make educational decisions this way. I graduate high school and go to 2 or 3 different colleges for 1 degree. One of them's overseas. And you see this because millennials grew up in a time of digital customization. As millennials grew up, the cell phone grew up. As millennials grew up, the computer grew up. So they were very used to mixing and matching. So I would say to an employer right now, just get ready for a bit of a free agent mindset. You can find loyalty in the builder generation. Maybe you got to earn it with a millennial generation. Okay, one last one. Gen Zers. Oh my gosh, I love these guys. So I interviewed middle school kids, high school kids, college students, and young professionals. And as I listened to them, they were all very respectful. Some listeners may not believe that, but they really were. They were very respectful, but they were very candid. They were raw. And the mantra I gave them as they move into adulthood was, I'm coping and hoping. So think about that. They're hopeful because they're young, but right now they may feel like they're just coping. They're struggling perhaps with mental health issues. It's been normalized to have anxiety disorders or maybe just wrestle with anxiety. It's been normalized to say, I'm seeing a therapist. And I'm not putting that down. I'm just saying mental health problems are now a thing. And if we just laugh at them and say, you bunch of fragile snowflakes, get with it, suck it up and do your job, I don't think that lack of empathy is going to get us where we want to get to when we want to build some disciplines and grit in this staff. So let me stop. I'm sure you're thinking something, Pete. I want to hear what you're thinking.
Yeah. Okay. Well, no, I think that's nice in terms of, all right, so we've got 5 generations and a little bit of a vibe and a little bit of a backstory. So
Yeah.
now let's all crash them together in the workplace. Tell us, what are some of the top do's and don'ts, maybe universally,
Yeah.
and then specifically. I mean, I suppose we could have a very long conversation with a matrix in this context, with this generation
Yes.
and that. So we can't do all that. But maybe give us some universal do's and don'ts, and then maybe a couple particular watch outs
Okay.
for areas of collision that are causing a lot of friction at work right now.
Yeah. Well, let me do the areas of friction right now, because listeners, if you're at a workplace, you're going to go, I've seen that. So number one, communication styles and mediums are different. You got to bring them together. In fact, I would say in the onboarding process, just say we use Slack, or we don't text, or we do text, whatever. But everybody's going to come in based on with a familiar source of way of communicating. And I think we need to say, to be together, let's do this at work. So communication. I think expectations. I have found in my data set, every generation comes in with slightly different expectations. So I tell interviewers or HR hiring managers, you need to talk over in the job interview preferences, expectations, and demands, because those are going to tell you a lot about whether you can take this person on as a team member and say you're going to fit perfectly here, or stop the interview right now and say, I can just tell you right now, that's not going to happen here. So let me show you the door and help you find another job. So real quick, I'll make this fast. Preferences. All of us have different preferences. Sometimes there are some generations that will handle preferences as if they're demands. They're just something they wish were true, but they'll come and say, I got to have this. And I would say hiring managers need to say, is that really true? Do you have to have this? Because it's not happening now. And if you just say, I got to have it, we can stop the interview right now. Preferences, however, are only wishes. I would prefer this to be the case. Expectations are stronger. When I began to talk about the expectation of a new potential team member, now they're saying, this is what I expect to be happening here. I expect a lot of autonomy. I expect to work from home or hybrid, that sort of thing. But you want to find out, what are you expecting here? You expecting unlimited PTO? Oh, wow, we should talk about that. And then finally, demands. This is absolutely huge. Believe it or not, this is a huge issue that far too often we hire, get a year into it, and then we find them out, and it's not a pretty picture. Demands are what perhaps either a boss or a new team member will say, I must have this. Like, I want to talk about politics at work. Well, I think the wise bosses say, you know what? We're not going to stop working to see where we disagree on politics. It's my opinion. But as I look at the data set on companies that are thriving, you want to have some liberty. But I'm telling you, sometimes workers divide over a political issue. And now we're not even good teammates. So that would be one. Those three I just mentioned. Communication styles. I think feedback. Think for just a minute, Pete, how people prefer feedback might be extremely different. And it might be good to establish the norms at this organization. For instance, baby boomers might still be fine with an annual review with full documentation. Well, Gen Z goes, seriously, I'm telling you data now. I want multiple check-ins with my boss. And if I don't get them, I think something's wrong. And bosses are becoming exhausted because they're going, I can't do that. I can't watch over you and say, good job, good job, good job, or whatever, that sort of thing. So I feel like just talking about feedback. So I have an entire chapter where I bring up these issues that are seen differently, primarily by the majority of each of these demographics, and how we might approach them to kind of lubricate the friction. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like perhaps the universal principle with these is to just upfront in advance, discuss, hey, these are sort of our norms and practices, and how we roll, how we do things, what we value. And just so you're aware, you can expect this from us, and you probably can't expect that from us. It's just short-circuiting the surprises in advance.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly it. In fact, one of the statements that you've heard a million times, I say in the book, conflict expands based on the distance between expectations and reality. Conflict expands based on the distance between expectations of what I expect and this reality. So real quick, if I tell my wife I'm going to be home at 7:00 for dinner and I get home at 7:05, no big deal. I get home at 9:30, it's a big deal. We have a conversation. And it's not because she can't live without me for 2.5 hours. It's because I created a different expectation, and that causes friction inside. So that's just good behavioral science that I think leaders ought to know, teammates ought to know. And you're right, talk about it up front, get it out in the open.
Okay. And so what are some don'ts? Like, don't do this.
Yeah. Well, I have found that my generation, I'm a baby boomer, we tend to just want to tell those younger generations what to do. And so let me tell you what I'm doing. I'm going to get very personal now, Pete. As a baby boomer who's 63 years old, will be 64 next month. You know how we've used that phrase forever and ever and ever. This is a leg you got to stand on. This is a leg you got to stand on. So I take the letters ALEG. It's a simple acronym, but I follow it to a T as I interact with perhaps younger teammates that just do something that I go, I do not understand what you just did or said or why you did it. So the letter A in a leg, I want to start by asking, not telling. Instead of barking out, what the doot were you thinking when you did that? I want to say, tell me what your thinking was. Tell me why you made that decision. And I need to be genuine about it. Ask instead of tell. When I ask questions instead of tell, they suddenly feel valued rather than condescended to. The letter L is listen. It does very little good to ask questions if we're not willing to really listen to them. So when I ask, they feel valued. When I listen, they feel heard. I believe this statement, being heard is so close to being loved that for the average person, it's indistinguishable. So this is an appropriate way just to say, I care about you. I love you. I'm listening. The letter E is empathize. So when I empathize, they feel understood. I want to just say, let's get to the bottom line. But empathizing means I say things like, oh my gosh, I had no idea you went through that. Or, wow, I bet that made you feel terrible when that happened. Something like that, where I'm not just listening, but I'm sharing with them, I'm really getting you. I'm telling you, Pete, if I'm asking, they feel valued, listening, they feel heard, empathize, they feel understood. Now I've earned my right to practice the letter G, which is to guide them. As their boss, I might have some guidance, but they're so ready to reciprocate respect and listening and so forth because I've taken the time to really listen. Think about a workplace that everybody was standing on that leg. I can't help but think we just have better workplaces.
Yes, thank you. You also have a fun turn of a phrase, reverse mentoring.
Yes. Yeah.
What is that and how do we do it?
Oh my gosh. It's my favorite activity that I do, and we recommend it to different people. So listeners, I challenge you with this homework assignment. Reverse mentoring is what it sounds like. So you get two people from different generations, older and younger. Doesn't matter which two, but make sure there's an older and a younger one definitively. And maybe you go to coffee or maybe you have lunch together, but you swap stories first. You're going to almost always find common ground when you swap stories. Then the older person naturally coaches up the younger in here's how to succeed at this workplace. But then you switch hats and the younger is now mentoring the older, perhaps on the latest app they just got and how we could use it for marketing. Remember Tony early in this conversation? So you're both doing this. So I meet with Andrew on a regular basis. I love Andrew. He's my VP of content and he's 30 years younger than me. I meet with Cam. Cam is on that content team, 40 years younger than me, recently minted from the University of Michigan. Brilliant guy. I learn every single time I'm with him. We laugh, we hug, and I'm not saying this is a cheesy, syrupy environment, but we have so much fun because we've all checked our logos and egos at the door and we're ready to learn from each other. And both are mentoring and both are learning. So I just think that's what we got to be like today in this rapidly changing world we live in.
Oh, lovely. Thank you. Now, could you share a favorite quote, something you find inspiring?
Well, in the beginning of the book, I share a really fun quote. My friend Derek Johnson from Orlando said this, and I just love it. Here's what he said. If you think you're smarter than the previous generation, consider this. 50 years ago, the owner's manual of a car told you how to adjust the valves. Today, it warns you not to drink the contents of the battery. So I'm thinking, oh my gosh, we're definitely evolving. We're definitely evolving right now.
All right. And can you share a favorite study or experiment or bit of research?
Way back in 1968, research was done that proved that young people, I think it's true about all people, but back then the experiment was with students. Students perform better under a teacher who has high expectations. That makes sense. In other words, when a control group really it's two control groups but one teacher was told, these are average students, you can have average expectations. But the other group, the teacher was told, now, don't you let these kids talk you out of working hard. These are genius kids. They're brilliant kids. You expect a lot of them. You can imagine the results. The teacher that expected a lot had grades that were per student a grade and a half higher. But they were told later after the experiment, both groups were average IQ students. But the performance was so great. Now, keep going. It was in the 70s they began to realize that high expectations alone don't do the trick. Because some kids feel like, oh, you're expecting too much of me, and they spiral downward and they give up. It wasn't until the 90s when research came out that showed this, and this is the piece I want everybody to hear. When a teacher or a leader has both high expectations and high belief, it's almost magical. High expectation, I expect a lot of you, and high belief, and I know you, and I know you can do this. It's just huge. So that'd be my favorite research that I'm trying to put to use every day here.
Could you help distinguish between expectation and belief?
Yeah.
Because in some ways there's a strong overlap. And so I want to get really clear on how they're different.
So I would say they're cousins, but not twins. So if I only have high expectations of, let's say, a person, but I don't have high belief, it feels harsh. You expect a lot of me, but I don't get the feeling you actually believe I'm going to do it. You just demand. So high expectation without high belief feels harsh. High belief without high expectation feels hollow. You say you believe in me, Mom, but you don't actually expect me to come through. You see what I'm saying? So one is about I'm demanding or holding you to a high standard, but belief becomes much more personal. So let me give you the phrase that Ivy League schools found was that magical I mentioned earlier. Here's the phrase, and I quote, I'm giving you this hard feedback because I have high expectations of you, and I know you can reach them. Do you see how that kind of gets to, I expect a lot, but I know you, Josh. I know you can do this. I've watched you. You have it in you to do this. The research shows effort went up a minimum of 40%, all the way up to 320% in males. I think there were a lot of boys that said, I've never had a dad say something like that to me. That's what I mean, but the difference between the personalness of belief and maybe the hardness of high expectation.
Okay. And a favorite book?
It's a book by Arthur Brooks, the most popular teacher at Harvard University. He wrote a book called From Strength to Strength. And that book just absolutely lit me on fire. But he wrote another book that I want to push about, if you don't mind. He just published a book called Build the Life You Want. He wrote it with Oprah Winfrey, because she found him and said, Arthur, you're amazing. So it's really about the art of really becoming happier, but that sounds so cliche.
All right. And if folks want to learn more or get in touch, where would you point them?
Well, my name is Tim Elmore, so timelmore.com. I have lots of free stuff on that site, but also if you ever wanted me to come and speak, that's where you would do it. But the nonprofit that I started focusing on the emerging generation, and where you can find the book, A New Kind of Diversity, is growingleaders.com, growingleaders.com. Thank you for asking that, Pete. I appreciate it.
Okay. And do you have a final challenge or call to action for folks looking to be awesome at their jobs?
Yeah. Well, I would really like you to practice that reverse mentoring I just mentioned, because I have found if I'm willing to do the work, I always come up better. The illustration I want to give you, that's the challenge, is this. If you and I were to hop on a plane and fly, let's say, to China, we would hop off that plane there in Beijing, knowing we're going to have to work harder to connect with people here. And we would naturally think that because we're going, oh my gosh, they speak a different language here. They have different customs here. They have different values here. Bingo. When you interact with somebody from a very different generation, different language, different customs, different values. So if I'm willing to do the work over there in China, be willing to do the work here at home with that person you're apt to not spend time with because you think they're so old, they're worthless, or you think they're so young, they're worthless, when in reality, they're a wealth of wisdom inside, just not the wisdom you have.
All right. Well, Tim, this has been fun. Thank you. I wish you much luck interacting with different generations.
Thank you, Pete. You too. Good to see you again.
I love Tim's perspective about turning frustration into fascination, and not just because they both start with F and they rhyme, which is kind of cool and easy to remember or retweet, but because really the source material of frustration and fascination are really the same. It's something novel and different from what you ordinarily do, and you can react with frustration like, oh, you idiot, why are you doing it that way? That's wrong. Or fascination, what leads you to do it that way? There's probably something to it, and I'm intrigued. Turning frustration into fascination can become natural because the source material that produces both frustration and fascination are the same. Again, if you want to check out the show notes or the transcript or the links to items that we've referenced, please drop on by awesomeatyourjob.com/EP915. And if you're looking for another swell podcast, check out our sponsor, the Management Muse podcast. Management Muse entertains, educates, and inspires managerial success. Join hosts and organizational scientists Cindy Baldy and Jeffrey Tumlin for an engaging exploration of the science and the art of good management. Episodes feature expert interviews, thought-provoking discussions, and practical managerial strategies you can put into action right away. Like How to Be Awesome at Your Job, the show provides valuable insights on productivity, resilience, and more from CEOs and other ballin' experts. The Management Muse podcast is a go-to resource for all things time management, communication, delegation, supervision, conflict resolution, stress management, and more. Whether you're a seasoned manager or just starting your leadership journey, Management Muse has some delightful wisdom for you. So don't miss out. Subscribe to the Management Muse podcast now on your favorite podcast platform and transform your leadership skills today. Hope to catch you next time, and peace.
Thanks for listening. To get the most out of the show, we recommend 2 key things. First, check out the extra resources at awesomeatyourjob.com. You can find this episode's transcript and links, as well as the perfect episode for your situation. You can search the full text transcripts of hundreds of episodes or explore episodes tagged by topic and competency covered. Second, subscribe to the podcast and get future episodes automatically. You can subscribe by telling Siri and several other smartphones and speakers, subscribe to the How to Be Awesome at Your Job podcast, or by tapping subscribe in your podcast player of choice. If you'd like some extra help figuring out podcasts and how subscriptions work, visit awesomeatyourjob.com/subscribe for guidance. Hope to catch you on the next episode of How to Be Awesome at Your Job.